Good afternoon. Welcome to the final seminar of our series for the first term. Really very pleased that Cynthia Lum from George Mason University is able to come and talk to us about a topic that is really important to Baltimore, but I think very important right now in so many cities across the country, where we're rethinking policing in really important ways. And as a school of public health, also, of course, very interested in prevention. So what Cynthia has to offer, I think, is very important for us. And I'm glad we have guests both from Baltimore Police Department as well as State's Attorney's Office with us today. Cynthia Lum is a professor of criminology, law, and society at George Mason University and director of its Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. This is really a fantastic center that's having a lot of important impact across the country. Dr. Lum researched primarily in the area of policing, security, evidence-based crime policy. Her works in this area have included evaluations of policing interventions and technology, understanding translation and receptivity of research in policing, and assessing security efforts of federal agencies. With Dr. Christopher Coper, she's developed the evidence-based policing matrix and the matrix demonstrations projects, translation tools that were designed to help police practitioners incorporate research into their strategic and tactical portfolio. Dr. Lum has been appointed to the Committee on Proactive Policing for the National Academy of Sciences, is a member of the Standing Committee on Traffic Law Enforcement, Transportation Research Board, the Research Advisory Committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the board of the Scottish Institute for Policing Research. She has a new book with Christopher Coper called Evidence-Based Policing, Translating Research into Practice, recently published, and it was really outstanding. Cynthia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, happy to be here. Thanks, Amy. Thank you, everyone. Really happy to be here at Johns Hopkins, returning to Baltimore. I used to live in Baltimore City, in Mount Washington area, and used to work here, so happy to return. Thank you very much for attending, and to our guests from the City Police Department and also from the State's Attorney, we really appreciate your time. I know it's very valuable. And students, this is a topic that I'm very excited about. I hope I can interest some of you in this area. It's really just a really wide breadth of things to study in evidence-based policing and in violence prevention, as all of you probably already know, taking classes with Professor Webster. So thank you again for coming. Today I want to focus a bit on the research and a sizable body of research evidence regarding effective crime prevention approaches that the police can take, and in particular, a focus on violence prevention. And I want to couch it, I'm sorry, wait, I'm supposed to stand here so that they can hear me. But I want to couch it in this notion of evidence-based policing. This is a really important, in my view, philosophy that has come about in policing and in police scholarship over the last 20 years. And it's really an approach that can help guide police with regards to some of their decision-making in terms of choosing tactics and strategies for violence prevention. Okay, so before I begin, I thought it would just be good to give you a very quick definition of evidence-based policing. This is, I'm not going to do it justice here, but I'm going to do it very quickly for some of you who are not familiar. I'm sure some of you already know about this. But 20 years ago, Professor Lawrence Sherman, who's a policing scholar at the University of Maryland, he's also at Cambridge, actually gave a lecture called the Ideas in American Policing Lecture. For those of you who are interested, it's a yearly lecture at the Police Foundation in Washington, D.C. But he said police practices should be based on scientific evidence about what works best. And what he was talking about here was really a philosophy that police decision-making shouldn't only be based on procedures, rule of law, experiential knowledge, ideological knowledge, case knowledge. By the way, these things are very important. Let me say that the police have to be attuned to all of these things, but that an additional source of information is really important for law enforcement. And that additional source of information results from systematic, scientific, evaluative study of a wide variety of different things in policing. And that this type of knowledge should at least have a seat at the table with regards to police decision-making. And so really the core of this idea of evidence-based policing is that actions that law enforcement take can be connected to the outcomes that they actually seek, or that the community actually seeks. And there's many different goals in policing, but in advanced modern democracies, I would argue that two goals are really paramount. And these two goals, for the students in the room, I sent an article ahead of time, and I talk about this in detail for those of you who are more interested in it. But the two goals that are really paramount in modern democracies, advanced democracies, is first the goal of achieving safety. And by the way, these are equal goals. One is not more important than the other. But one is achieving safety, and I put that as kind of detecting, preventing, deterring, responding to crime. The second is achieving trust and confidence of citizens. And I think this is easier said than done. Policing is a very hard profession, precisely because law enforcement has to balance these two things to optimize them. It's a very difficult proposition, essentially. They need to optimize it, but they also need to minimize the harm that can come to people by doing these two things. Whether they can cause harm by trying to prevent crime, they can also cause harm through community policing, interestingly, different types of harm. So I think, though, that this is best said. I brought a clip with me because I think that the citizens of Baltimore in this clip really express this much better than I could with regards to this dual responsibility of policing.
Post Freddie Gray, it's actually way worse.
Shootings left and right, stabbings.
In May alone, it's been record numbers of shootings and homicides. A lot of them were in this neighborhood and surrounding neighborhoods. This is the preview of what we're gonna be hearing and dealing with all summer long. This is my first time in my 29 years, ever being kind of nervous being outside. I never felt unsafe in my neighborhood. And it's always been a crazy neighborhood, but I never felt unsafe. The murder that happened on my block actually happened on the opposite corner of where I live, right next to the liquor store. I was scared. Because, just because they were at that corner, didn't mean they wouldn't run up the street, continuing the fire. And the biggest part of my, worry is my boys. I have 2 small boys. So, we could be out doing regular, random things, and because we live in this neighborhood or in the high crime neighborhood, something can happen where we're just enjoying ourselves and bullets are flying.
There was an interview on TV, and they had a Baltimore City cop blurred out, and his voice was muzzled. But he was saying that since the Freddie Gray situation, the cops have came together and almost on a let's not respond right away type of situation.
Officers, stop being proactive.
Not patrolling.
Not patrolling, just stop being proactive.
Not talking to the community.
Not telling them to stop being proactive. I believe it's a direct result from officers holding back.
We could see it as a community, because this ain't never happened in my lifetime that fast. Every day, multiple shootings over the weekend. It was 9 shootings a couple weekends ago. Just, it's coming like magic. It's just turning around.
We need the cops. We don't need the violence from cops, but we need the actual cop duty in the presence of our community. We need that. School is about to be over in about 2 weeks.
So I thought I would stop there because what Tiffany is saying, I think, really captures it. The community needs the police. They need the police to provide safety. But at the same time, the police have a bigger job of respecting the community as well and providing that safety in a way that doesn't degrade the trust and confidence of people. And that's a tough job, and you can hear it in her voice. She gets it. She has a sophisticated understanding of the police, and it's a balanced understanding of the police, as does Tavon. But it's hard, and research can't resolve this. Let me just put this out there. I think some of the criticisms of evidence-based policing is like, oh, research can fix all this stuff. No, of course research can't fix all this stuff. But research is important because it helps connect. It helps try to connect interventions and actions of the police to particular outcomes. And that's something that is important because we are spending time, the police are spending time, they are spending money on a lot of different types of interventions. And I think the general hope is that it'll bring down crime, it'll bring down homicide, but it's not always the case. All right, so so how do we effectively deal with crime and disorder and violence, but also how do we achieve trust and confidence with folks? And that's a difficult question. There's now actually a fairly sizable amount of research that speaks to some of this. I don't have time today to go into all of this research around this topic, but I'm going to just briefly touch upon the crime prevention research today. And what I'm showing you here is the evidence-based policing matrix. Professor Webster mentioned this to all of you when he first started with the introduction. And I don't have time to go into the matrix today, but basically we created the matrix to create a freely accessible tool that police, the community, students can access in terms of the body of literature surrounding policing interventions to reduce crime. And we created this tool in such a way that we can glean generalizations from that literature. Why are we trying to do that? Because we often when I work with police officers, they're like, well, that applies to Baltimore. That doesn't apply to my community. Well, yes, it does apply to their community. There's a lot of generalizations that can be gleaned from research across different jurisdictions, and that's what the matrix is. We go into this research in much more greater detail in the book. But I'd like to give you kind of the key generalizations from this research and then talk about what this means with regards to evidence-based policing. Okay? So today, I want to just focus on 6 generalizations from this sizable body of research with regards to crime prevention. And for the police officers in the room, you definitely don't have time to go through all of this research. But this is really the summary of what this research says regarding effective crime prevention, and a lot of this relates to violence. Okay, so the first principle that comes from our research, over-reliance on arrest will not reduce crime. I think this is the hardest principle for police to hear. It certainly is the hardest one for me to have heard when I was a police officer in Baltimore, and I think it is a tough one because cops are interested in catching bad guys. I mean, they get rewarded from it. They feel a sense of satisfaction when they do catch people that have committed serious crimes. And I think this principle is a little bit tough to swallow. I think it's important to understand that the research shows that while investigation of crime is very important, it's not enough to create community safety per se. We know this because the research tells us a few things. First, clearance rates have been remarkably stable for the last 30 years. I'm working on some studies of clearance rates right now. The clearance rates for violent crime in particular, robbery has remained somewhere between 30 to 40%, the average of across the U.S. Aggravated assault somewhere between 60 to 65%. Homicide clearance has declined in the United States over time since the 1980s. It used to be in the 90s, and now it depends on where you're at, but it can be as low as 60 or 70%. So homicide clearance has declined. And let me say this decline and this stability is irrespective of widely fluctuating crime rates. Okay, so in other words, more arrest does not equal less crime. Okay, and this was something that I think folks believed 20 years ago. Secondly, we have research that focuses on reaction, so reactive arrest, getting to the 911 call faster. We now know that getting to the 911 call faster does not equal more arrests. Students, I know the cops know this answer, but students, can you tell me why this is the case? If I get to a 911 call faster, will I catch somebody? Will I be more likely to catch the perpetrator? What do you guys think? Yes or no? If you called 911, is the robber standing next to you that took your money at the ATM, right? No, the guy is gone. He's already taken off. And most people take time to call the police. First they called their moms, then they called their cousins, and then they call the cops, especially with things like burglary. The time lag is so long for people to call the police. Auto theft and things like this, all right? Even in violence, the police aren't always called quick enough to get there to catch the perpetrator who did it. We also now have a great deal of research on deterrence that says arrest does not necessarily specifically or generally deter crime. In other words, what I mean by this is that if I see you get arrested, if I see some of you get arrested for committing a robbery, that might not deter me from committing a robbery tomorrow. If I get arrested for a robbery today, that might not deter me from committing a robbery when I get out of jail. Okay? So the specific and general deterrent value of arrest is mixed, and in some cases, we don't have any evidence necessarily that points to this. And finally, are all of you familiar with zero tolerance? The use of misdemeanor arrests for minor crimes. This was something very popular in the 1990s in large cities in the United States. It tended to decline around the time of the recession in 2007 or 2008. But this increase in the use of misdemeanor arrests we now know is not connected to reductions in violence. This is something connected to a theory called broken windows theory. I don't know if any of you have heard of something like this, okay? So the notion behind broken windows arrests to reduce violence is not supported in the research necessarily, okay? So there's a large body of research that kind of points to this fact that over-reliance on arrest it's not enough. Okay? The second principle, officers are much more effective when they are proactive and not reactive. Proactive policing, it stresses prevention. It stresses anticipating crime before it happens, and a disorder and other problems before it happens, using things like crime analysis, intelligence-led policing, problem solving, community input, right? These are things, and other techniques that feed into this notion of being more proactive. Proactivity, this principle de-emphasizes the more reactive, rapid response, beat patrol of more traditional policing activities that have been going on for a very long time, that still continue to this day. And it suggests that the time in between calls for service, I'll get back to this, but I like to call it golden time because it's really where the gold is for policing. But the time in between calls for service is the most significant time with regards to police and their abilities to be proactive. Now, how to be proactive is, and how to do it well is still relatively an underdeveloped concept in policing. Research tends to focus on things like measuring proactivity, on testing different types of proactivity and their inputs on crime, and also on community sentiment. But this is still an underdeveloped area, really, in police interventions. However, implementing proactivity effectively in terms of both creating safety and community legitimacy is really the challenge. The research continually indicates that proactivity is one of the most important tools that police officers have to prevent violence. Okay? Proactivity, one of the most important tools police have to prevent violence. I think there's been some recent backlash against proactivity, but I feel some of this is kind of narrowly defines what proactivity is about, and it is sometimes just incorrect. And there's a wide range of proactive tactics available to police to prevent and deter crime. The first is something that many of you probably are familiar with. It's police presence, but police presence specifically trying not to necessarily increase apprehension, but in increasing the manipulation of the perceived risk of apprehension. This is something very different than actually doing an apprehension via targeted enforcement and focused deterrence. Another type of, and these are just examples that are in the matrix where you see some positive impacts on crime prevention. The second is tackling opportunity structures for crime. Crime is created, for those of you who have taken intro to criminology, you should know this, but crime is created from a combination of opportunity structures for crime and intersecting routine activities of individuals, guardians, potential suspects, potential offenders, witnesses, victims. And those opportunity structures and those routine activities create hotspots of crime. They create places that have high levels of crime. Proactivity tends, the positive proactivity tends to target some of these opportunity structures. And finally, there is some evidence that building informal social controls through community policing, and in particular through problem solving with the community. Not all community policing is effective in creating safety. But problem solving, and I can get into this a little bit more, but problem solving with the community has been shown to be much more effective and have some long-term effects in terms of violence reduction. Okay? Each of these things have consequences. Each of these things have different levels of effectiveness. One of the things that policing scholars look at constantly, one of the things that I do a lot, is trying to understand the effects that different ones create and which ones might be better for what types of problems, what types of crimes, and what types of communities. Okay? As you can see, and I've only hit the first two principles, but you can see that policing is really a sophisticated profession, really. It really requires a sophisticated level of thinking about not only the origins of crime and how crime happens, but also how police can deal with crime. And this is why I would argue that law enforcement really needs to partner with researchers, because researchers can't do policing. We're horrible at policing. But we can do good research and help the police in that way. Okay, third important principle that comes from the research. Places are often more fruitful for crime prevention than targeting people. Okay, police can be effective if they proactively patrol, investigate, mitigate places where crime opportunities concentrate, and not just react to individual offending. A great deal of patrol and investigations is about reaction to individuals, to people, to particular cases of victimization. We worked with Richmond Police Department once to try to create a unit in their investigative group that just would investigate places and not people. That was challenging, but nonetheless, it gets at this idea that we can be much more effective when we focus on places. And the reason for this, the basis for this idea that places can be fruitful in crime prevention is not only in the opportunity structures and routine activities that I mentioned to all of you, because those things also do concentrate, but it comes from literature that's known as the criminology of place. And this literature continues to find that crime is incredibly concentrated. In fact, about half of all crime is concentrated in about 1 to 5% of an entire city's addresses. I don't know what that means to all of you, but in Baltimore City, this would be like a couple hundred streets that we're talking about, compared to the thousands of streets that are in Baltimore, where crime is incredibly concentrated, right? This kind of gets at the myth, oh, that's a bad neighborhood. No, it's probably not a bad neighborhood. There are places inside that neighborhood that are difficult, that are challenging, and there are other streets that have no crime. For those of you who are from Baltimore, who have worked in Baltimore, this is something that I think you would agree with. But crime is incredibly concentrated. Let me also say that I'm working on a project now where we're doing these concentration calculations across 43 jurisdictions. And in those 43 jurisdictions, violence seems even more concentrated than nonviolent or property crimes. I mean, this is really important in that, in other words, we can determine a small group of streets that are responsible for half the violence, if not more, in any given city. For those of you who are interested in suburbia or rural places, we think crime is even more concentrated in these places. Okay? So maybe less than 1% of all the places in a suburban area have 50 to 75% of the crime in that city. Oh, by the way, let me just say that going back to this third principle of crime, the police can be much more effective when they focus on places and not just people. It's also, we also have research that kind of indicates that police don't have to stay at a crime hotspot for really long periods of time to create what's known as residual deterrent effects. What this means is when a police officer gets to a hotspot and he or she leaves, there's a residual deterrent effect of his or her presence. We think that police officers only need to stay in these hotspots around 10 to 15 minutes to create an optimal level of residual deterrent effect. In other words, they don't have to stay for a whole a day to create those effects. Okay, fourth principle, very important. If you have to focus on individuals, individual-based strategies are most effective when they are targeted and when they are focused. So enforcement and prevention approaches that focus on high-risk offenders, gangs, probationers, parolees, people who are repeat offenders, violent offenders, is much more effective than indiscriminate a focus on offenders. And in particular, individual-based strategies are very effective when they are multifaceted, when they include, for example, the state's attorney's office as a partner or the community as a partner, when they are based on sound risk assessment and intelligence in terms of identifying the most difficult offenders and the most challenging offenders, and also those that focus on offenders within crime hotspots, okay? Because you're now targeting both the opportunity structure and the offenders at the same time, who are very much part of those routines that are creating those crime concentrations. Okay, fifth, very important principle of, that comes from the research is that officers are more effective when they tailor their actions to particular problems. Police are much more effective when they create bespoke and tailored approaches to crime problems or to violent crime than just attacking it in a general way. The reason for this, do you all remember when I mentioned opportunity structures and routine activities? Those are very specific to certain places and to certain groups and to certain areas, right? Attacking those particular problems with some general approach seems, just from the research, less effective than tailoring to particular problems that are creating those issues, particular opportunity structures, particular routine activity, convergences that are creating particular problems.
Just give an example.
Sure. Yes, I definitely will. Let me just say that, so problem-oriented policing, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it initially was developed by someone named Herman Goldstein, who was from the University of Wisconsin, and who's an emeritus at the University of Wisconsin. And he developed basically I like to think of it as kind of a scientific system to deal with problems. SARA is the model: scanning, analysis, research, response, and assessment. So that A, we're scanning for the problem, we try to figure out what is the underlying problem that's causing repetitive crimes to occur in the same place. Crime is very, in many ways, repetitive. For those of you who don't study criminology, crime is often repetitive. It often is ordinary. I don't mean to diminish victimization, but it happens for ordinary reasons. Even homicide happens for very ordinary reasons in many ways. People get into arguments or whatever. So problem-oriented policing suggests, okay, what is the underlying problem that's causing the same crimes to happen in this place over and over and over? Is it as simple as there's not enough lighting? Is it more complicated in that people aren't closing, like in the dorms, for example, here at Johns Hopkins? I don't know if Johns Hopkins has dorms, but you don't close the door and people come into the dorms and start stealing stuff, right? These are opportunity structures that create the opportunity for certain types of crime. So scanning, analysis of that, it's not just about knowing what's happening, right? It's also about understanding the relationship of opportunity structures to crimes that are occurring. The R in SARA is response. its effective response to particular problems. So you wouldn't throw any response to a particular problem, but what would be a tailored, bespoke response that would handle this particular type of issue? So for example, you have a neighborhood bar that's causing lots of problems, selling alcohol to minors at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? That's a very different type of a problem than people who might be shooting each other on a street because of some open-air gun market, a drug market that happens to be in that location. Okay? And they require different types of responses. And finally, the A is for assessment. It's about, okay, now that we've implemented this response, how can we assess whether or not this response was effective, right? So problem solving is like a more systematic, structured process in which we make decisions about how to deal with underlying problems. And let me just say that problem-oriented policing is most effective when police are devoting sufficient resources to the A, the analysis. One of the most important units in policing right now is crime analysis, hands down. If somebody asked me, where should we spend money, I would say, double your crime analysis unit, right? Because that's a really important area. A lot of master's students, by the way, become crime analysts, and PhDs become crime analysts. But police devote sufficient resources to careful problem solving and long-term and short-term response implementation when they are applied in crime hotspots, when they target high-risk actors and groups, and when they are done in partnership with people who know about these problems. And that is the people that live there, or the community, and other criminal justice and community partners. Okay? By the way, some research in Jacksonville, Florida, seems to indicate that problem solving, as opposed to general hotspots patrol, might create longer-term impact on crime prevention, more sustainable impact on crime prevention. Hotspots often creates a deterrent effect, and it often creates a short-term crime reduction, but oftentimes that's not sustained unless the hotspot approach is sustained. Okay, finally, the sixth principle that comes from the research is community support and input is often needed to achieve evidence-based policing. Let me clarify this a bit. There's a belief that community-oriented policing can reduce crime. We now know from a large body of research that community-oriented policing does not often reduce crime, okay? But that's not also why we do it. Remember going back to the two principles that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, right? The police aren't only responsible for reducing crime, they're also responsible for achieving trust and confidence with folks. And community support and input is often needed to achieve these things. It's also needed to do problem solving. But let me be even more specific, because I don't like talking about community policing in vague ways, right? Let me give you all about 5 or 6 points about community policing, about a community orientation in policing that are really important that come from research. One, the community is an incredible source of information for problem solving. You can't do the S and you can't do the A without input from people who are actually living the problem. Okay? Secondly, transparency, legitimacy, and consent. When police are planning to implement something, when they're planning to implement an intervention or a tactic in a particular location because it's a high violence or high crime area, they tell the community about the intervention and work on gaining consent and approval, right? Because ultimately this is democratic policing, and so the police operate from consent of the community that they operate in. This is probably the one that was the weakest when it came to the issues of stop, question, and frisk and zero tolerance. Okay? And this really came out in the last few years, that weak spot in policing. Third, regularly gauging community sentiment. Let me say that in policing we do, law enforcement does great in terms of recording crime. This has really been a really important development in democratic policing, the recording of crime. So when you all call 911, somebody answers, somebody writes a report, it gets reported, and most often, unless it's something that the police don't respond to, they're going to respond to your house. This was not always the case. This is not the case in a lot of different places that I've worked in. For example, Trinidad and Tobago. You have to go to the police station to report a violent crime against you. Okay? So this is a challenge. However, although the police are really good at recording crime, they haven't been so good at gauging community sentiment about their activities. Oftentimes, they're doing this through community meetings, through interactions with individual people, community leaders, but we have very little understanding of how people view different types of interventions of the police. This area right here is a puzzle to academics as well. How to accurately survey, how to accurately assess and regularly assess community sentiment, especially in communities that are very hard to reach, okay? Or that are not interested in answering questions from pointed-headed academics. Okay, procedural justice. Have all of you heard this term? Procedural justice. Okay, it comes from a theory by Tom Tyler that suggests that it's important to give people a voice, to be respectful, to explain and communicate why you're doing something. But I would argue that you cannot have procedural justice unless we have distributive justice. What do I mean by this? I mean, you can stop somebody on the street for a pedestrian stop or stop, question, frisk, and treat them as nicely and decently as possible. But if you stop them based on racial prejudice, that's a problem, right? So distributive justice is just as important as procedural justice. And when we're talking about effective community-oriented engagement, especially for enforcement activity to deal with violence, because oftentimes you need enforcement activity, both these two types of ideals are important. And finally, a sophisticated understanding. Community policing, in my view, when we talk about specifics, means a specific understanding and sensitivity with regards to consequences of actions within the community. It's not enough to know we have implicit bias. I hope this is not a surprise to everyone. We all have implicit bias, okay? It's not enough to know that. It's more important that police have a sophisticated sensitivity about how their actions might lead to disparities, whether or not those disparities are caused by explicit racial bias, right? This is important because disparity is considered a negative in democracies, as it should be, okay? By the way, I can go into I know I'm kind of speeding through some of these things, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So let me say that that was a very quick, oftentimes I spend a whole semester just talking about all this literature. There's so much research out there. And by the way, the quality of the research is varied. And so believing certain research over other research is a challenge and a discussion in and of itself. It's an academic discussion as much as it is a policing discussion. But nonetheless, I want to just end by making a particular point, okay? And do y'all remember when I first started with evidence-based policing? Police practices should be based on scientific evidence about what works best. Well, I showed you the scientific evidence, right? Is that enough to achieve evidence-based policing? No, it's definitely not. Okay, it's just the knowledge, it's just the information, it's just the research, and we need a great deal more about it. Let me just say, this is the 6 principles that I mentioned. Over-reliance on arrest, not enough. Officers should be more proactive. Places, not people. Individual strategies that are more targeted. Officers are more effective when they tailor actions to problems. We need community input. Okay, this is the summary of research that is fairly valid. This research is replicable. This research has been examined by many different types of organizations and different types of people in terms of the validity of this research. The challenge is how to implement these findings into practice. At the center, we work with a great deal of police agencies, from very large ones to very small ones. And you have a number of progressive police leaders that are trying to do this. They probably are trying to do this in Baltimore. They're trying to achieve some of these things, right? Because they are effective in reducing crime. But they're often frustrated. And the reason why they're frustrated is this. The current policing approach is often at odds with this stuff, guys. This is what makes it interesting and challenging, but also hard, right? A lot of the current policing approach often is at odds with the evidence. What do I mean by this? A great deal of research, a great deal of policing focuses on arrest. It focuses on reaction. It focuses on individuals and their individual cases, not necessarily prevention, proactivity, and outcomes. Patrol and investigative deployment is often focused on people. It's individual case-by-case approach, not necessarily on places, not necessarily on problems, and not in a tailored or bespoke way. A great deal of patrol is general and ad hoc. It's not tailored, targeted, or strategic in many ways. And there's also a high level of unstructured discretion in American policing. I'm not talking about Baltimore. I'm talking about almost every place that I've ever encountered has a great deal of unstructured discretion in patrol during that golden time that I mentioned before, with very little supervision about how officers are handling that particular time. Let me add to this challenge. And I think, and maybe the police officers in the room can respond on how they think about this, but I think I think evidence-based policing is even more challenging because that traditional policing approach, the current policing approach that goes kind of not against but doesn't align itself well with the research, is deeply embedded into everyday systems of policing. I'm not talking about some kind of specialized unit or special system of police. I'm talking about the everyday systems of policing, the overall mission, the expectations that both officers and citizens have of the police. Training systems, general orders, things like history, tradition, just everyday habits in patrol, investigations, and management, how officers are writing reports, what they consider important, how they start their day, how they start their shift off. Patrol and investigative deployment structures, technologies. Not only is the traditional policing approach deeply embedded in the technologies, but technologies can also reinforce this particular type of approach. 911, radio cars, the CAD system were really important advances in American policing. They also solidified the reactive approach to policing. And it's probably one of the main reasons why the police are very reactive today, are these things right here. Also supervision, management, and leadership structures and styles. This current approach is deeply embedded into this, as well as incentive structures, rewards, and promotions. So you all can understand this is like a wicked, in social science we call this a wicked problem. Everything is kind of connected to everything else, and it's deeply, it's like the Borg. Oh, God, I'm so glad you guys laughed at that, because sometimes I'm with the groups that don't know what the Borg is. Yeah, resistance is futile. The Borg from Star Trek, right? Yeah. Where, they assimilate people with, okay. I'm hoping that some of you know what I'm talking about. So achieving evidence-based approach to violence reduction requires much more than generating research knowledge and knowing the research knowledge. We can't just tell officers, hey, go be more proactive, be more place-based, stop focusing so much on arrests. It's not enough. It's definitely not enough. What needs to be done, and this is the same list that I showed you before, but what really needs to be focused on, and I think what a lot of agencies are trying now, is recalibrating some of these systems, recalibrating them to be more receptive to what we now know in research is effective violence prevention. Okay? And that really involves not just generating evidence, it involves translating that research into digestible forms that are meaningful to the police and not just pointy-headed academics, right? It means to create systems of receptivity in the police on, okay, how do they receive this information? It's not enough to just train officers on this knowledge. How do they incorporate it into their everyday policing? It's also about institutionalization. You know how I showed you that slide on recalibrating systems in policing? That's what I mean when I talk about institutionalizing research ideas into policing systems. You have to dig into those systems, like promotions, for example. This is a tough one, because sometimes unions are involved in terms of what is asked in promotions exams, how promotions exams are implemented, and what is the focus of promotions and rewards. And finally, things like operationalization or implementation of things like hotspots approach. I want to close by just giving you an example of how hard this is, but how sophisticated policing has really become, I think, with the advent of research evidence. And it's just an example of an area that I tend to work in a lot, so I'm going to use it. But let me just give you an idea of what needs to be done to operationalize proactivity. You know, the second principle, that police should be more proactive, it's more effective than being more than reactive. Let me give you an example what this entails. We can't tell officers only in their training to be more proactive. However, it's an important start. It's an important start to train officers in what types of proactivities are out there that they can use. Right now, I run a lab at George Mason called the Proactivity Lab. We study all things police proactivity. And one thing we're finding when we're going into agencies and when we're doing systematic social observations of their proactivity is that they tend to do two types of proactivity. Police officers in the room, what are these two types? What's the most common proactivity that you think your officers are doing? Say that again? That isn't arrest-based. Calls for service is a reaction, right? It's like more of a reactivity, but that's actually a good idea. But what's the most typical proactive thing that they're doing when they're not answering calls for service?
Driving around in their cars.
Driving around, and they tend to try to drive around in places that they think are high in crime, right? Or they think they might catch somebody committing a crime, right? We hope. And then the second one, maybe? Traffic stops. These two things are the primary proactivities that we think our police are doing by looking at the CAD data and also doing systematic social observations with them. But proactivity has an incredible breadth of different choices, right? But officers are focused on this. Why? Somebody tell me. Students, anybody. Why are they focused on these two things?
Well, traffic stops you can count.
Yes, okay, so they can be recorded in the CAD system, right? And the officers have the materials they need to do traffic stops. Traffic stops are also taught in the academy. That's like one of the, important things that police officers are taught in the academy. When they get out of the academy and they do field training, they're learning from their field training officers what they're doing. So the major said driving around, right? That's one of the first things I figured out in patrol. I need to drive around. I need to find people that I can stop. This is the mentality of the officer, right? Where are the hot spots? Who's selling drugs, right? Not necessarily looking at any kind of analysis or anything like that, but just trying to figure this out and go to these places and do what I think is good policing from what I'm seeing from other people, right? So you all can imagine if we want to operation, so these blue things right here are the calls for service and the minutes that it takes for calls for service. If we're trying to operationalize this area here, this golden time, we not only have to give officers a stronger toolkit about what they could do here, they also have to understand the consequences of the different things they do here. So if you use stop and frisk indiscriminately, like when I was in patrol, it was used indiscriminately. We did stop and frisk, unfortunately, all the time, right? Pedestrian stops all the time, more so than car stops, okay? If you use it indiscriminately, what is going to be the consequence, right? What is the disparity that you're going to create? How are you going to disintegrate your interactions with people? How can I target, if I do use pedestrian stops, which can be, by the way, very effective in reducing gun violence? So we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but if we're going to use it, how can we use it effectively? How can we tell the community what we're going to be doing? How can we use it to deal with gun violence as opposed to low-level drug use, right? Which is not a legal way to use stop and frisk, okay? But you guys can imagine what has to go in here with regards to training, with regards to field training, with regards to what officers are doing on their day-to-day basis. And then let me add some more things in here. Supervisors have to help officers figure out what they're doing here. They've got to monitor it. They've got to help young officers who aren't sure what to do here, and they don't have that toolkit about how to deal effectively with this area here, okay? So you can imagine the systems in policing that have to be dealt with just to implement principle number 2, okay? It's not enough to say, be more proactive. We've already tried that, okay? This is the level of sophistication that policing is really about. So I guess, let me just say that I know this sounds like a great deal of effort, but I really want to get across to all of you that policing, in my view, is a complicated subject. It's a very sophisticated profession. It requires a great deal of knowledge. It requires analysis. It requires research. It also requires thinking about how to deal with things like this. This is a typical 90-minute period in any officer's day that's happening right now across the whole city, across the whole United States. This is happening all over everywhere, right? How do they wield this area right here to create the most effective safety and not degrade community relations, right? That's the big challenge. And so I guess I would say this is my comeuppance also, because I wish that I had, known some of this when I was a police officer. I would have been a better police officer, I think. I wasn't a great police officer. And a lot of it is because, I had no idea about all of this, right? And so this is really important, I think, for us to think about as we move forward in policing. We can't stop proactivity just because of certain types of proactivity that were very unpopular in the past. We have to figure out how to do it right. Okay? So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions. And I'm told you should go to the microphone.
How do you measure the effectiveness of your golden time?
Say that one more time.
I say, how do you measure the effectiveness of the use of golden time?
Oh, goodness, I love this question. In a variety of ways. So the current way that folks have measured the effectiveness of golden time is to come up with ideas for proactivity and implement them using experimental approaches. So for example, they would choose 100 hotspots, randomly assign 50 to receive the treatment, 50 as a control group, and then run the experiment in a police department, in real life situation, run the intervention and see how it does in terms of crime prevention. That is one good way to do it, but that's not always the best way. Why? Because we're not even sure what the cops are doing during this golden time. So in our lab, for example, we're taking 2 steps back. We're trying to figure out A, what they're doing, B, can we adjust some of or can we expand the proactivity toolkit? And sometimes we use things like statistical modeling in order to understand the impact, the deterrent impact of a proactivity at any given point in time, and then what happens 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes after that. And do that, I don't know how to, some of you are science buffs, so you might understand what I'm talking about, but to do that over 200, 300,000 events that happen in a year in terms of proactivity. So you can measure it experimentally. You can also measure it by modeling, which we're doing both of these types of things in our lab. But it's a challenge. And both have pros and cons. Experimental research, you're testing a particular type of idealistic intervention that you've developed, right, with a police chief, for example. The statistical modeling, you're looking at the reality of proactivity and the impact of those proactive events on residual deterrence and deterrence over time. So it's a challenge, but it can be done. Yes, you can measure when something doesn't happen, right? Okay. Yes, sir.
What are the specific kinds of proactivity that your research has found to be effective?
Yeah. So the question is, what is the most common proactivities that research has found to be most effective? The first is I would say, I'm going to call it a general statement. The research continually points to hotspots approaches as being the most effective proactivity to create a deterrent effect for crime prevention. However, there's some caveats to this. Okay? Getting to the hotspot and figuring out what you're doing at that hotspot are 2 totally different things, right? So police officers can get to the hotspot and they can ride around, or they can show their presence. They can stop for 10 to 15 minutes and they can create a residual deterrent effect. When that officer gets out of their vehicle and talks to someone, that has a different type of an effect. So pedestrian stops And by the way, it can also have unintended consequences. So it can have negative impacts with communities as well. So that's at the very general level. Then there's problem-solving approaches. These are so varied, I don't have time to tell you about them, but just to describe them generally, these are ones that try to identify a particular type of problem and then attack it using a very specific approach. So for example, lots of people shooting somebody in a hotspot, that involves something called, one thing that's very effective to deal with that is something called focused deterrence. It's like identifying these individuals, providing a lot of both formal and informal supervision of these folks, and then creating, I use this term carefully, but threats to them. So look, we know that we don't know right now that you're shooting anybody, but we know that you have the potential to do it. We want to watch you, right? We are on you. This is a focused deterrent approach that doesn't necessarily emphasize apprehension, but it emphasizes it increases the perceived risk of apprehension. Things like stop and frisk. I get this question all the time. Cynthia, does stop and frisk work? Yeah, it can be effective in reducing violence at gun hotspots. But I also tell the police it can be very ineffective and damaging when it's used indiscriminately, and when you don't have the consent of the community. So this is a challenging area. But gosh, there's so many other, I'm not even sure. You could do something called situational crime prevention, which doesn't really involve an enforcement effect. It's like manipulating the environment so that you can manipulate the opportunity structure that's at that location that's creating the crime problem. You can do things like something called CEPTED. Are you all familiar with this? Crime prevention through environmental design, where you can adjust aspects of a building or a street to create a crime prevention effect. So problem solving and proactivity is a wide range of different types of things. Okay. Wait, I think we have, yes.
I was curious about the role of violence interrupters. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that program here in Baltimore, where they're using basically people who have been either perpetrators of violence or they've been through the criminal justice system, and they use them as kind of a team to go out after there's a shooting and try to prevent a retaliatory shooting.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, definitely.
Cool. I just wanted to see if you thought that was what the role of that was and what you're talking about. Is that something where police should be working with these groups, or can it be used more as a model for ways police can be more involved in the community, or how would you fit that in?
There's mixed findings in this area. So a lot of Project Safe Neighborhoods programs and Operation Ceasefire programs use things like this, but there are mixed findings. So for example, there is some research that looks at ex-gang members trying to detach new gang members from gangs, and those have sometimes been successful and sometimes not. I think it probably depends on how well social services are attached into these groups, because oftentimes it's also about things like employment, things like detaching people from violent peers, for example. So I would say we shouldn't just leave it up to what we think in our minds might be a good idea, right? Because often you need some more structured social service and employment services and probation and parole services to kind of back up some of these good ideas that are really focused on de-escalation, essentially. Yeah, Daniel.
I'd like to get you to talk a little bit about moving from the indiscriminate stop and frisk to what you think is ideal.
Yeah.
What does that look like? And secondly, this whole process of getting community buy-in, consent to towards those sorts of practices to create safety there. Can you those two things I think are the most critical in my mind to thinking about proactive law enforcement that's focused on gun violence.
I know. This is probably the hardest. So in response to the first part of your question, I would argue a couple things. One, we need to discern the hotspots better. So right now, in policing, police agencies are using maps. They're doing hotspots analysis, but hotspots are often very specific locations, like a specific alley, a particular intersection, a part of a block. It's not even the whole block necessarily that may be the hotspot. It could be a particular house in that block, a particular part of that block. And I think targeting, determining those hotspots better through geographic analysis and also by talking to people on the street about exactly where, because geographic analysis is only as good as the data you got. And sometimes the CAD does not, it's like, oh, that happened on the 200 block of such and such. 200 block of Port Street or 300 block of Port Street. That's a huge, that's a whole block. You know, it could happen, the incident could have happened anywhere. It could have happened in the middle of the block or the end of the block. So first, targeting better. Secondly, lawful stop and frisk. I think the rise of the zero tolerance approach in the mid-1990s really led to a lot of indiscriminate policing. Not just stop and frisk, but also arrests of minor offenses like loitering. And I was a part of this time period in policing, so I'm not casting judgment on the police about this. I understand the reason why the police, why officers are doing this. They saw this as good policing, being aggressive, trying to control drug problems on the street. But a lot of those stop and frisks are illegal. So doing them legally and for the right reasons, for guns, not necessarily for searching for small amounts of drugs, I think is another very important part of kind of moving from indiscriminate stop and frisk to more targeted and focused. I also think we need to detach broken windows. This is a hypothesis because it still really needs to be tested more. But I think we need to detach broken windows from a pedestrian stops. These two things were very much connected in the late 1990s. Misdemeanor arrest and stop and frisk were kind of mushed together in this enforcement activity. It's not my opinion, you can see this in the data. I just finished a paper on this where you can see this rise of the zero tolerance arrest approach. And I think that led to creating a culture of stop and frisk in some police agencies like Baltimore, where there's high levels of gun and drug crime. So targeting, lawful, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater though, guys, because pedestrian stops, especially in places where we think people are carrying guns, is an important way to stop violence in those areas. Second question is harder, Daniel. So the second question is about gaining community legitimacy. And I would say that if I had to answer as an academic, I would give you some information that we know from research. Tell people in those places what you're about to do. Talk to them. Tell them what's coming. Talk to them. Say, this is the type of enforcement that we're going to be doing. What do you think about this? Right? And there used to be a time in policing where they didn't want to tell the community because they felt that it would give it away. Right? If it gives it away, even better. Right? Because if it creates a deterrent effect, you're better off. Good. Right? This is like the whole TSA thing. We don't want to tell. I did a study on TSA once where I'll probably go to jail for telling you this, but it's like, it's secured. Yeah, I know. It's secured sensitive information that they're searching your luggage behind when you check in your luggage. That's actually secured sensitive information. I'm not supposed to be telling you that, okay? But you all know that they're doing this, right? And they give you a piece of paper, right? And my view of it is if you tell someone it stops somebody from putting a bomb inside their suitcase, I am happy that people know what the police are doing. So I think just that element of telling people what the intervention is, explaining, getting their feedback on when it turns bad, right? Because the people of Baltimore, the level of stop and frisk is so high, they know when the cops are treating them right and when they're not treating them right. And there are good cops out there that know how to do stop and frisk in a respectful manner. And there are bad cops out there that do it incredibly poorly, right? Let me also say, do you all remember when I was talking about procedural justice and distributive justice? There's a movement that says, okay, if we do stop and frisk, it has to be procedurally just. I still don't think that's enough. I think we really need to think about whether or not we're targeting people based on how we think they're dangerous because of their skin color or because of their gender or their age or what have you. And this is has to be a sophisticated thought process and thinking around this, and also analysis, and also that the officers know that disparity can come when they are doing stop and frisk. So gaining that community consent to me is a lot about talking to folks that are actually going to be at the receiving end of an intervention. Not necessarily like the whole city of Baltimore. There are some people in the city of Baltimore that will never get stopped and searched. We need to be focused on people who are going to get stopped and searched and what do they think about it. And that is tough. I'm sorry, Daniel, did I?
Yeah,
I don't know if I
think you nailed
I don't
it.
have the answer. I don't have the full answer because this one is hard.
I think we should do an experiment to see whether community acceptance is greater with stop, question, and frisk with fewer misdemeanor arrests.
Oh gosh, that would be, yes. Yeah, that would be a perfect experiment because it would require a more surgical approach to the use of pedestrian stops. Policing, guys, I know that it may not seem this way right now. We're in a tumultuous time. But policing is like surgery. Johns Hopkins, this is a good place to talk about it because it's like surgery. It's not like I don't want someone doing open heart surgery on me that is using a hammer, okay? So that kind of thinking, Daniel, it requires the deployment commander, whether it's the sergeant or the lieutenant, to really be able to have better control over deployment. I just got back from Australia a couple weeks ago, and all we focused on there with their deployment commanders was how to help them gain more control over their deployment. Because most of them, like the commanders in the United States, are more reactive. They step in when an officer makes a mistake or needs some guidance on something specific, but they don't have a strong command over the deployment that's happening during the golden time, interestingly. So yes, that's a good experiment, Daniel. A very expensive one, I'm sure. I think we have one. Do we have a couple?
This might be a little convoluted.
Yeah.
Studies that I have read show that the challenge in recruiting young officers who are able actually to communicate effectively with those that they're policing has been challenged recently. I'm sure the cell phone it has impacted that. And I'm curious to know whether you think we are simply asking our law enforcement officers to do too much, and whether our recruiting of officers that aren't necessarily reflective demographically of the areas that they are policing also add an undefined layer of complication in what you're asking in regards to evidence-based.
Those are great questions. Let me try to respond very quickly. First of all, when asked, do I think I'm asking too much from officers? No, I think that the problem is that we're just like indiscriminately asking officers to do all sorts of things without a strategic plan, without good training, without knowledge of which of those things are effective. Technology is a great example. Cops get thrown technology at them constantly from vendors, and most of it has no impact on their outcomes, by the way. Let me just say, a lot of the fun stuff that looks sexy, very little impact on police crime control or community relations. So it's not about officers being asked too much. It's that they're being asked to do everything, and like 50% of it's probably not effective. So figuring out what to do in a structured way is what I mean by recalibrating a lot of the systems of deployment, right? Recruitment. I am very optimistic about people. I think we can be taught things. I do not think that people come in because of there used to be a belief that we should hire more females as cops because somehow we could be more sensitive and deal with child abuse and things like. Now I worked in the child abuse unit, so maybe that's not a good example, but I would get calls all the time in patrol. Oh, Lum, I need an interpreter for Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. I don't speak any language. I speak a little Spanish. I'm from LA, right? And so it's not about recruiting, and it's not that young officers nowadays don't communicate well. Sometimes I think of the younger generation, I think sometimes they're better communicators than we are, because they're more open to different types of people, and I watch folks that are talking right now about police reform, younger folks, and they have a sophisticated understanding. Tiffany has a sophisticated understanding of what policing is about, and she's probably, at least 15 years younger than me. So, I feel that it's not about who we recruit in terms of race, where, gender. It's about what the tools we're giving them, how we set up the expectations that they have when they get out into field training, because that undoes a lot of what happens in academy training. How the supervisors convey what the sophistication of policing to these young officers, how these young officers are interacting with technology. So some of the areas that I study is in police technology, and technology can often have a backfire effect on officers. If you give them a lot to look at like this while they're driving their car, they lose some of their situational awareness. Has nothing to do with the fact that they're young or they're old. Both the young guy and the old guy will have less situational awareness because of that interaction with that technology. Some technology helps. Other technology has both help and hurt, right? So I don't believe the solution is necessarily who we hire. That's like one cog in a big machine that can undo all the good intentions of hiring people from inside the city, or women or minority. That's just my sense of it. The research, I think, would probably support that view.
I think we're out of time. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel.